An American general stood at a helicopter landing zone in Bien Hoa Province on the morning of May 12, 1968, watching Australian troops pile out of arriving aircraft into a dust-choked clearing, still crackling with the sound of a firefight happening barely a kilometer away. He watched for a while. Then, according to the account preserved by Australian veterans who were present, he turned to the nearest Australian officer and said something that should have stopped the entire operation cold. He said, in almost conversational terms, as if he were commenting on the weather, "Tell your commanding officer that you won't need to go looking for them. They'll come looking for you." Then he walked away. He did not elaborate. He did not follow that statement with a briefing, a map overlay, an updated intelligence estimate, or any kind of formal communication that could be relayed up the Australian chain of command and incorporated into the deployment plan that was already in motion. He just said it and left. And the Australians, flying in by helicopter in a piecemeal fashion throughout the rest of that long, confused, sunlit day, continued arriving into terrain they did not know, in an area of operations their doctrine had never been designed for, against an enemy whose strength, disposition, and immediate intentions had not been adequately passed down to the men who were about to spend the night in the middle of it. By 3:30 in the morning of May 13, 1968, that failure would have a body count. Wait! An Australian task force, the same force that had been running rings around the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy Province for 2 years, got inserted into an area thick with North Vietnamese Army regulars, with incomplete defenses, dispersed companies in exposed ambush positions, 2 artillery batteries placed over 1,500 meters apart, and no clear intelligence passed to battalion commanders about what they were walking into. And all of this happened not because of enemy deception, not because of bad weather, not because of some unforeseeable catastrophic accident of war, but because the insertion was a confused, piecemeal mess from the first helicopter lift, and because the intelligence about a substantial enemy presence had failed to travel down the chain of command to the men who needed it most. Oh, this story is so much more complicated than the word battle suggests, because what happened at Fire Support Base Coral between May 12th and May 16th, 1968, and then at Fire Support Base Balmoral until June 6th, was not simply a fight that the Australians stumbled into. It was the foreseeable consequence of a series of institutional decisions and planning failures that stacked on top of each other like unstable ammunition crates, and the men who paid for those failures were artillerymen fighting hand-to-hand around their own guns in the dark, and infantry soldiers calling artillery fire down on their own positions to stop from being overrun. One official Australian assessment of the Coral deployment, written with the careful, restrained language that military after-action reports favor, contained a conclusion that, if read carefully, constitutes a damning institutional judgment. The intelligence about the presence of formed bodies of enemy forces moving toward Saigon, intelligence that existed and was known at higher command levels before the deployment, was not passed to the battalion commanders or to any of the subunit officers who actually led men into those ambush positions on the night of May 12th. The written orders confirmed it. The mission structure confirmed it. The way the companies were dispersed confirmed it. Nobody on the ground who was about to be attacked had been told, in any operationally useful form, what was waiting for them out there in the rubber and scrub beyond the unfinished wire. This is the story of Australia's largest, longest, and bloodiest battle of the Vietnam War. And to understand how it almost went catastrophically wrong, you need to understand the long chain of events and decisions that put the 1st Australian Task Force in the middle of Bien Hoa Province on the night of May 12, 1968, in the first place. The first Australian task force was not supposed to be in Bien Hoa Province. Everything about the Australian commitment to Vietnam had been built, argued for, and carefully negotiated around one fundamental principle. The Australians would operate in Phuoc Tuy Province under their own command, using their own methods. That arrangement had been established in 1960X through negotiations between General William Westmoreland and the Australian Chief of the General Staff, and it reflected a genuine strategic calculation on the Australian side. Their force was small, approximately 8,000 soldiers at peak strength against 500,000 Americans. Spread thin across multiple provinces, they would accomplish nothing. Concentrated in one province, using the patient, intelligence-driven counterinsurgency methods they had developed through the Malayan Emergency and the Indonesian confrontation, they believed they could actually pacify an area. And in Phuoc Tuy, they had been doing exactly that. By early 1968, enemy-initiated incidents in the province had dropped significantly. The Bien Hoa 5 Provincial Mobile Battalion was on the back foot. Local security was improving. The task force had developed intimate knowledge of the terrain, the local population, the enemy's patterns, and the infrastructure of the conflict. They knew Phuoc Tuy the way a man knows his own backyard. Bien Hoa Province was someone else's backyard, and when the political and military crisis of early 1968 forced the Australians out of Phuoc Tuy and into an entirely different operational environment, everything that made the Australian system work, the accumulated intelligence, the established patrol patterns, the community contacts, the familiarity with the ground, was left behind at Nui Dat, 3 hours away by helicopter. The crisis that triggered the deployment was the Tet Offensive of January and February 1968. The scale and audacity of the communist attacks on South Vietnam cities shook the American military and political establishment to its foundations. More than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops struck simultaneously at urban centers across the country. The attacks were militarily repulsed at enormous cost to the communist forces. By most credible estimates, the Viet Cong main force was essentially destroyed as an effective fighting organization during Tet, but the political damage in the United States was irreversible. Walter Cronkite went on American television and declared the war a stalemate. Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war's domestic political foundation in America began cracking in ways it would never fully repair. But the military situation on the ground in South Vietnam was more complex than the American political collapse suggested. The North Vietnamese had taken catastrophic losses, and yet their strategic purpose remained unchanged. General Vo Nguyen Giap and the Hanoi leadership were already planning a follow-up offensive, a second wave of attacks on Saigon designed to exploit the political crisis in America and demonstrate that Tet had not broken the communist will. Allied intelligence was picking this up through captured prisoners, defectors, and document exploitation. There was going to be another offensive. The question was when, and whether it could be disrupted before it fully assembled. It was in response to this intelligence that the Americans launched Operation Toan Thang, translated as Complete Victory, on April 8, 1968. It was the largest combined operation of the war to that point, eventually involving approximately 70,000 troops from the United States, South Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, and Thailand. The operational concept was a massive cordon around Saigon, designed to intercept and destroy North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces moving toward the capital along infiltration routes that ran south and southwest from War Zone D and War Zone C through the rubber plantations and scrub country of Bien Hoa and Long Con provinces. The 1st Australian Task Force joined Toan Thang on April 21st. Initially, they deployed to the Hat Ditch area on the border of Phuoc Tuy and Bien Hoa provinces, familiar enough ground that it did not represent a complete departure from their operating environment. They conducted patrols, made contacts, engaged Viet Cong units. Then, on May 3rd, 3 RRR was relieved by 1 RAR as the main infantry element, and on May 5th, the 2 Australian battalions, 1 RAR under Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett, and 2 RAR were redeployed further north, deeper into Bien Hoa Province, farther from Nui Dat, closer to the concentrations of North Vietnamese regulars that intelligence suggested were moving south. The Australians were now operating in territory that American units had been fighting through for months, territory that, as the visiting American general's comment at the landing zone had made clear, was saturated with enemy forces. The mission given to the Australian Task Force for the next phase of Toan Thang was to move north and establish fire support bases that would interdict enemy infiltration routes leading to Saigon. It was a fundamentally different kind of operation from anything the Australians had done in Phuoc Tuy. In Phuoc Tuy, the task force had operated from a fixed, well-prepared base at Nui Dat, with established logistics lines, pre-plotted artillery fire missions, intimate knowledge of every major trail and hamlet in the province, and years of accumulated intelligence about enemy patterns. What they were being asked to do north of Bien Hoa was to fly into unknown terrain, establish temporary fire support bases in an area of operations they had never worked before, and hold those bases against whatever came at them while infantry companies patrolled the surrounding jungle. It was not counterinsurgency. It was conventional defensive warfare in the middle of an enemy operational area, against an enemy that was moving in regiment-sized formations rather than the platoon and company-sized Viet Cong units the Australians knew how to fight. And the critical piece of information that should have shaped every aspect of how those fire support bases were established, how the perimeter was configured, how the companies were deployed, and how the artillery batteries were positioned. The intelligence that the NVA 7th Division was operating in the area in substantial force and was actively preparing for renewed attacks on Saigon did not reach the battalion commanders and their subordinate officers in any form that allowed them to act on it. The Australian official history of the war, written by Ian McNeill and Ashley Eakins and published in 2003, addressed this failure directly. The intelligence existed. It had been processed at higher command levels. Concerns about a substantial enemy presence only arose in practical terms after the force was already committed. Battalion commanders strenuously denied being told that enemy forces in regimental strength were in the area. Sub-unit officers had no information about formed bodies of the enemy operating nearby. The deployment orders themselves were structured around the assumption of light to moderate contact, not the kind of massed assault scenario that would materialize in the early hours of May 13th. The companies were sent out in dispersed ambush positions up to 4 kilometers from the fire support base, exactly the right disposition for hunting small Viet Cong units in Phuoc Tuy, and exactly the wrong disposition for defending against a conventional NVA battalion assault in Bien Hoa. The occupation of Fire Support Base Corral began on the morning of May 12, 1968, and it was, from the first helicopter lift, an object lesson in everything that can go wrong when the machinery of a large multinational operation is running against you. The proposed landing zone turned out to be unsuitable for helicopters. The terrain around the original selection was wrong. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Shelton of 3 RAR, was forced to designate a new location over 1,000 meters to the southwest, which meant revised coordinates, revised flight plans, revised timings, and a cascade of delays that would ripple through every subsequent lift for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, American forces in the immediate area were in contact with the enemy. Fighting in the night and into the morning had kept American units occupied, and the helicopters that had been earmarked to lift the Australian battalions were diverted to support the American fight. The aviation assets that the Australians needed were simply not there when the plan called for them. The reconnaissance parties and the forward gun elements of 102 Battery managed to get in, but the main body of the battalion arrived in a piecemeal trickle throughout the day, each lift delayed, each unit landing into an area that was still being sorted out around them. By the time the last elements of 1 ROR were on the ground, there were only 2 hours of daylight left. The perimeter defenses were incomplete. The wire was thin or absent in sections. The 2 artillery batteries, 102 Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, and 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, had been positioned over 1,500 meters apart because the configuration of the terrain and the confusion of the occupation had left no better option. That separation created a defensive perimeter that was too large for the available troops to cover adequately. The positions had been prepared under pressure, in failing light, without the time necessary to dig proper gun pits, establish proper fields of fire, or construct the kind of layered defensive barriers that the Australian military's Malayan emergency experience had taught was essential. The mortar platoon of 1 RIR was positioned on the northern perimeter, directly across what would turn out to be the enemy's chosen axis of assault. Having been ordered to interdict enemy movement, the rifle companies were quickly dispatched to ambush positions in the surrounding countryside. A company, B Company, and C Company moved out into positions up to 1 kilometer north and south of Coral as darkness settled. They were doing exactly what their orders told them to do, and exactly what their training had prepared them to do in a counterinsurgency context. Out in the jungle scattered across several kilometers, they established their ambush positions and waited. Inside the partial perimeter of Fire Support Base Coral, the gunners and the mortar platoon finished what preparations they could and tried to sleep. The North Vietnamese had been watching all day as the helicopters had come and gone, and the Australian positions had been marked out, and the wire had been strung. North Vietnamese observers had been recording everything. They knew where the artillery was. They knew where the mortar platoon was. They knew the perimeter was unfinished, and that the rifle companies had moved out into the bush. Hundreds of North Vietnamese troops moved into their forming up positions in the rubber and scrub to the northeast of Coral under cover of darkness. At around midnight, patrols from 12 Platoon made contact with 3 figures who had entered their ambush position. Then, at around 2:30 in the morning, a sentry at the mortar platoon's position reported something that in any other circumstances might have seemed impossible. There were approximately 400 enemy troops 50 meters away. They were gibbering, that was the word used, making noise, moving, getting ready. Then the mortars began falling. Rocket-propelled grenades arced through the darkness and crashed into the mortar platoon's position. Machine gun fire swept across the gun line. Then the human wave came. NVA soldiers moving fast through the gaps in the wire, through the darkness, directly at the artillery and mortar positions that the intelligence had told someone, somewhere, would be there. The mortar platoon was overrun almost immediately. Inside the artillery position, gunners who had been sleeping minutes before were tumbling out of their weapon pits and wrestling the 2¼ ton howitzers to point north. Number 6 gun, part of 102 Battery, was hit by a satchel charge and temporarily overrun. The gun sergeant, in a moment of professional composure that deserved more recognition than it ever received, removed the firing lock from the howitzer before the enemy reached it, rendering it useless to them. He then fought his way back. The machine gunners, who had been positioned out in front of the artillery in protective pits, took immediate casualties and were forced to abandon their pits under fire and run for the relative safety of the gun positions. The mortar platoon's commanding officer, Lieutenant Tony Jensen, was a man in an impossible situation. His platoon was being overrun. His men were being killed in their pits. There was nothing between the NVA assault force and the complete destruction of the mortar platoon except the guns of 102 Battery. And the guns were also under assault. Jensen made a decision that in the cold calculus of survival was the only decision left. He called for Splintex rounds to be fired directly onto his own position. Splintex was an anti-personnel artillery round, essentially a massive canister shot that sent thousands of steel darts, flechettes, screaming outward in a cone of lethal metal at close range. Jensen shouted to his men to get down, to press themselves into the earth, to not raise their heads, and the artillerymen of 102 Battery, fighting their own close-quarters battle around their guns, managed to fire 5 rounds of Splintex directly across the mortar platoon's position. The flechettes tore through the darkness in a storm of shredding metal. The enemy soldiers trying to overrun the mortar platoon were torn apart where they stood. When it was over, there were only dead North Vietnamese around the Australian pits. Jensen and his surviving men looked up from the dirt. This was not how Australians were supposed to be fighting in Vietnam. In Phuoc Tuy, the infantry went looking for small enemy units in familiar jungle, found them, ambushed them, and killed them efficiently with small arms and pre-planned artillery. Artillery did not fire on its own positions in Phuoc Tuy. Gunners did not fight hand-to-hand around their howitzers in Phuoc Tuy. Mortar platoon commanders did not call artillery fire on their own men in Phuoc Tuy. These were things that happened in a different kind of war, a conventional war, a war of fronts and massed infantry assaults and artillery duels, a war that Australia had not fought since the Second World War. Coral, on the night of May 12 to 13, 1968, was a Second World War battle transplanted into a rubber plantation in South Vietnam, fought by men who had been prepared for something fundamentally different. Around the artillery, the fighting continued for over 2 hours. Number 4 gun kept firing high explosive over open sights directly into the oncoming NVA, a tactic that artillerymen are trained for but rarely need to use in any modern conflict, the equivalent of turning a naval gun to point at the ships alongside you. The infantry companies, in their ambush positions outside the perimeter, heard the noise and began calling for artillery support themselves, which meant the battery was simultaneously fighting for its own survival and trying to provide fire missions for companies that were also in contact in the darkness beyond the wire. Somewhere in the chaos between the RPG rounds and the mortar fire and the human wave assault and the calls for support from the scattered companies, the Australian gunners did all of it. They fought and they fired, and by the time the C-47 spooky gunships arrived overhead and began throwing light and minigun fire across the battlefield, the NVA assault was beginning to falter. By 6:30 in the morning, the enemy had broken contact and withdrawn into the rubber and scrub to the north and northeast. The helicopters came in at first light to take away the wounded and the dead. In one mortar platoon of 18 soldiers, 5 were dead and 8 were wounded. 13 casualties in a unit of 18 men. 11 Australians were killed in the first attack, 28 wounded. The enemy had left 52 bodies inside and around the perimeter. The real NVA casualties were certainly much higher, as the drag marks in the dirt and the blood trails leading north made clear. Number 6 gun was damaged beyond immediate repair by the satchel charge. 2 mortars were destroyed. The Australian task force had survived the night, but 3 more Australians died in patrol contacts on May 14th, and by that point, everyone on the ground understood that what had happened was not a chance encounter. Fire Support Base Coral had been targeted deliberately, struck by a prepared force that had watched the insertion and chosen its moment, and the reason the defenders had nearly been overrun was the combination of an incomplete perimeter, scattered rifle companies that could not quickly reinforce the base, and the absence of any intelligence warning that an assault of this scale and sophistication was coming. The second attack came 3 days later. At 2:30 in the morning on May 16th, Coral was struck again, this time by a North Vietnamese force estimated at 3 full battalions. A squadron of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, with armored personnel carriers, had arrived at Coral in the interval and was now part of the defense. The 1 RRR rifle companies were in better positions. The perimeter was more complete. The artillery was better oriented. And critically, this time the Australians knew what kind of enemy they were dealing with. They had improved their defensive positions in the interval with the desperate efficiency of men who have already been overrun once and have no intention of surviving that experience again. The second attack was beaten back. Part of A Company's position was briefly occupied, but the enemy could not hold it against the weight of fire from small arms, artillery, armored vehicles, and the spooky gunships that returned to work the northern approaches. The NVA withdrew again. Again they left their dead. The pattern was becoming clear. The North Vietnamese 7th Division, or units thereof, was using Fire Support Base Coral as a target precisely because its existence astride the infiltration routes threatened their ability to reinforce and resupply the planned second offensive against Saigon. They could not ignore it. They had to destroy it or drive the Australians off. And they had committed the professional mistake of attacking a defensive position twice, using roughly the same approach route, which meant the Australians could now plan their defensive fires with a precision that had been impossible on the first night. On May 22nd, another rocket and mortar barrage fell on Coral, but this time the mortar platoon was alive and ready, and one RAR's mortars caught the NVA infantry as it was forming up for a ground assault. The assault never materialized. The gunners and infantry had learned, in the hardest possible way, what this enemy looked like and how it moved. They were not the Viet Cong of Phuoc Tuy Province. They were North Vietnamese regulars in divisional strength, equipped with anti-tank weapons, indirect fire assets, and the tactical sophistication that came from years of conventional warfare training. Opposing them required a completely different approach than anything the task force had practiced in its own province. By this point, the task force commander, Brigadier Ron Hughes, had already taken steps that the first night's disaster had made obviously necessary. He ordered Centurion tanks forward from Nui Dat, 4 centurions from 1 troop, C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, arrived at Coral. The tanks of 2 troop moved to a new fire support base, Balmoral, that 3 RAR was about to establish approximately 4.5 kilometers north of Coral. The Centurions changed the tactical equation at both bases in ways that the NVA had not anticipated. An RPG round that would punch through the aluminum armor of an armored personnel carrier and kill everyone inside merely scratched a Centurion's 60-ton hide. Fire Support Base Balmoral was established on May 24th and 25 by 3 RAR, operating now with the hard-won knowledge of everything that had gone wrong at Coral. The positions were better prepared. The perimeter was finished before nightfall. The Centurions were positioned at the most likely approach routes. The intelligence picture, while still imperfect, was now informed by 2 major engagements rather than the false assumptions that had preceded the first night at Coral. The North Vietnamese attacked Balmoral on the night of May 25th to 26, a sustained assault by a full NVA battalion. This time, the defenders were ready. D Company of 3 RAR was directly in the enemy's path. The Centurions fired canister rounds, essentially enormous shotgun cartridges, each one releasing hundreds of steel balls in a lethal fan, directly into the NVA assault formations. The infantry weapons of D Company added to the weight of fire. The attack wilted. Only 6 enemy dead were found in front of the Australian lines, but the drag marks and blood trails told of casualties that were certainly far higher. The North Vietnamese came again on the night of May 27 to 28. They used a feint against a company on Balmoral's southern side to draw Australian attention, then committed their main force against D Company from the north. But D Company had not been fooled by the feint, and the main assault ran directly into the same defensive fires that had stopped the first attack. The enemy advanced over the same open ground they had crossed 2 nights before, apparently unable or unwilling to adapt their approach. The Australians were waiting. The canister rounds went out again. The assault broke and withdrew, leaving 42 confirmed dead and 7 prisoners. The actual casualties were certainly higher. Balmoral had held. On May 26th, between the 2 Balmoral assaults, something happened at Coral that showed how far the task force had traveled from its near disaster of 2 weeks earlier. Tanks from 1 troop, C Squadron, combined with D Company of 1 RAR, moved outside the perimeter wire to the northeast, to the direction from which the attacks had come, and assaulted a discovered NVA bunker complex. The tank crews fired canister rounds that shredded the jungle foliage and exposed the enemy positions. The infantry followed up. The bunker complex was destroyed. There were no Australian casualties. The force that had nearly been overrun in the small hours of May 13th, fighting by candlelight around guns that the enemy was trying to capture, was now going on the offensive against fixed NVA positions in the surrounding jungle. The transformation, bought at a price that should never have been necessary, was complete. By the time the Australians withdrew from the area on June 6, 1968, the balance sheet of the Battle of Coral Balmoral looked like this: 25 Australians dead, 16 from 1 RAR, 6 from 3 RAR, 2 from 12 Field Regiment Royal Australian Artillery, 1 from 161 Independent Reconnaissance Squadron, over 100 Australians wounded. Against that, somewhere between 267 and 327 North Vietnamese confirmed killed, with the true figure certainly higher given the enemy's systematic practice of dragging away their dead. 14 prisoners taken, hundreds of weapons captured. The NVA 7th Division's ability to mount renewed assaults on Saigon through the corridors north of Bien Hoa had been significantly degraded. The Battle Honour Coral Balmoral was subsequently awarded to the Royal Australian Regiment, the 1st Armoured Regiment, and the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, one of only 5 battle honours approved for the entire Vietnam War. In that narrow sense, Coral Balmoral was an Australian victory. The task force had been hit by a divisional-strength North Vietnamese Army force conducting deliberate attacks on defended positions, and it had held, and it had inflicted devastating casualties, and it had ended the operation in an offensive posture. For a force of roughly 2,000 to 3,000 against an enemy of similar or greater strength, with the advantage of choosing the time and place of attack, this was a substantial achievement, but the victory cannot be separated from the failures that made it so costly. The battle that the official history would call Australia's largest, longest, and most hazardous engagement of the Vietnam War was also, in a very real sense, a battle that should not have been necessary in the form it took. The intelligence existed. It was not passed down. The deployment was delayed and piecemeal, with helicopters diverted away from the Australian lift to support American forces already in contact. The defensive positions were incomplete when the first assault came. The companies were dispersed in ambush positions designed for a counterinsurgency fight, not concentrated in defensive positions capable of rapidly reinforcing a base under attack. The 2 artillery batteries were placed far apart in a configuration that created a perimeter too large to defend with available troops. None of these decisions was random or accidental. Each was a consequence of the situation created by the deployment conditions. Operating outside a familiar province, in terrain no one knew, in a framework controlled at higher levels by an American-dominated operational structure that had generated the intelligence but failed to ensure it reached the people who needed it. The visiting American general, who had remarked at the landing zone that the enemy would come looking for the Australians, had known something essential about the ground his forces had been operating on for months. He knew the NVA was there, in strength, and operating aggressively. He said so, in passing, to someone near the landing zone. And then he walked away, and no formal intelligence update found its way to the companies of 1 RAR who spent the night of May 12th in dispersed ambush positions while hundreds of enemy soldiers massed in the darkness between them and their guns. The men who bore the consequences of that institutional failure were the gunners of a 182 battery, who fought hand-to-hand around howitzers that had been in their gun pits for less than 12 hours. They were the mortarmen of 1 RAR, who lay face down in the dirt while steel darts from their own side swept over their heads because there was no other way to stop dying. They were the 17-year veterans and the brand-new national servicemen alike, thrown together into a defensive position that the planning process had left naked at precisely the point where the enemy chose to strike. Brigadier Ron Hughes, the Australian Task Force commander, was not a man given to extravagant language. After the battle was over and the task force had returned to Nui Date, he described the fighting at Coral and Balmoral as some of the heaviest fighting that the task force ever undertook. That understated assessment measured against 2 years of hard combat in Phuoc Tuy, against the Battle of Long Tan in August 1960X, where 108 men held off more than 2,000, against all the ambushes and sweeps and cordon operations and minefield clearances and rice cache destructions and patrol contacts that made up the fabric of the Australian War, tells you everything about the scale of what the task force faced north of Bien Hoa in May 1968. Long Tan, which had entered the mythology of the Australian Army as the definitive test of the task force's combat capability had lasted 4 hours. Coral Balmoral lasted 26 days. Long Tan had been D Company of 6 RAR, 108 men, in a rubber plantation during a monsoon rainstorm. Coral Balmoral involved 2 full infantry battalions, 2 artillery regiments, armored cavalry, and eventually Centurion tanks, fighting a series of deliberate attacks and counterattacks against a divisional-level enemy in terrain that the Australians had never operated in before. Long Tan was an ambush gone wrong that turned into a defensive stand. Coral was a defensive stand that had to be improvised from nothing in the dark against an enemy who had watched every move of the occupation and struck before the defenses were finished. The contrast with how Australians normally operated in Phuoc Tuy was not lost on the men who survived it. In Phuoc Tuy, the accumulated intelligence of 2 years meant that the task force almost always knew more about the ground than the enemy did. Patrols moved in silence, with purpose, against targets defined by patient collection. Ambushes were set where the enemy was expected to be, because the intelligence said he would be there. The Viet Cong came to fear the Australian sector precisely because the Australians were rarely surprised and almost always positioned where they needed to be. The NVA regulars facing them north of Bien Hoa had none of that disadvantage. They knew the ground. They had been operating there for months, moving through trails the Americans had never properly mapped, using supply lines the coalition had never fully interdicted. They watched the Australian insertion and identified the vulnerabilities before the Australians themselves understood what those vulnerabilities were. In the months and years after the battle, Australian military analysts and historians picked carefully through the planning and execution of the Coral deployment. The questions they asked were not comfortable. Why was the intelligence about the NVA presence not passed to battalion level? Why were the companies dispersed in ambush positions rather than held in reserve to defend the base? Why were the artillery batteries positioned over 1,500 meters apart in terrain that created a defensive perimeter too large for available troops to cover? Why were the helicopter lifts allowed to proceed on a piecemeal schedule that left the base in a half-finished state at nightfall? Some of these questions had answers that were genuinely satisfying. Some had answers that pointed to the structural tensions in the Australian position as a junior partner in an American-dominated operation, where Australian forces were being used to accomplish operational objectives that had been designed at levels above the Australian chain of command, and where the information flow between those higher levels and the Australian battalions had critical gaps. What is beyond dispute is that the men of 1 RAR and 3 RR and the gunners of 12 Field Regiment and 161 Battery fought with extraordinary skill and courage in conditions they should not have faced in the form they faced them. Lieutenant Tony Jensen's decision to call Splintex onto his own position was not in any manual. It was a judgment call made in the dark, in a matter of seconds, by a man who understood that if he did not act, then there would be no mortar platoon left to save. The gunners who swung the 105mm howitzers around to fire over open sights at enemy soldiers inside their own perimeter were trained for that contingency, but had never expected to need it. Private Richard Norden of 1 RAR, who made 3 separate dashes through heavy fire on May 14th to rescue his wounded section commander and drive the enemy away from an Australian body, was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The gun sergeant who pulled the firing lock from No. 6 howitzer before the enemy overran it and fought his way back through the assault to his own lines embodied a kind of professional composure that the chaos of the moment should have made impossible. These were not lucky escapes. They were professionals doing their jobs in circumstances that their system had failed to adequately prepare them for, and doing those jobs well enough to survive and ultimately to prevail. The Battle of Balmoral was not widely recognized in Australia at the time. The political climate in 1968, the rising domestic opposition to conscription, the moral exhaustion that the Tet Offensive had produced in Allied publics, the sense that the war was consuming lives without producing outcomes, meant that a costly, hard-fought defensive battle in an unfamiliar province did not generate the kind of commemorative attention that Toan Thang had. The task force came home from Bien Hoa, returned to Nui Dat, resumed operations in Phuoc Tuy, and the battle slowly receded into the specialized memory of those who had been there. It took decades for the recognition to come. In 2008, on the 40th anniversary of the battle, the then Governor-General of Australia, Major General Mike Jeffrey, presented 102 Battery Royal Australian Artillery with the honor title Coral, making it the first Australian artillery unit ever awarded such a distinction, the artillery equivalent of a battle honor. That recognition acknowledged something that should have been acknowledged much sooner, that the gunners of 102 Battery had done something in the early hours of May 13, 1968, that their predecessors had last been required to do in the Second World War. They had fought in close defense of their guns against a massed infantry assault. They had done it in a half-built fire support base in the dark, without adequate warning, with an enemy that had been watching them all day and had chosen its moment with lethal precision. They had done it while also firing in support of the infantry companies scattered in the bush outside the wire. And they had held. The battle honor Balmoral itself was awarded to the Royal Australian Regiment, the 1st Armoured Regiment, and the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, recognized formally as one of only 5 battle honors approved for the entire Vietnam War, in a conflict that lasted a decade and consumed the service of over 60,000 Australians. What the battle demonstrated, stripped of its institutional complications and its planning failures and its intelligence gaps, was that the 1st Australian Task Force was capable of fighting a kind of war it had not been trained or equipped or operationally prepared to fight, against an enemy far larger and more conventionally organized than the counterinsurgency doctrine it had been built around, in terrain it did not know, under command arrangements that had not ensured it received the information it needed, and winning, not comfortably, not without cost, not in the way that the Australian system at its best had been designed to work, but winning. 25 dead, over 100 wounded, 300 enemy dead, the infiltration routes blocked, the NVA operational plans for a renewed assault on Saigon disrupted, the fire support bases held. But the Australian memory of Balmoral has always contained that other dimension alongside the pride, the dimension that asks why the first night was as bad as it was, the dimension that looks at the 5 dead and 8 wounded in an 18-man mortar platoon, at the gunners fighting hand to hand, at the howitzer temporarily overrun in the darkness, and asks what would have happened if the warning had come, if the intelligence had been passed, if the perimeter had been finished, if the companies had been held back instead of pushed out into the bush. The Australian answer to those questions is not expressed loudly. It is carried quietly, in the way that military institutions carry the lessons of their hardest days. The general walked away from the landing zone. He had said what he knew. The helicopter lifts continued. The darkness came down. And in the small hours of the following morning, 400 North Vietnamese soldiers emerged from the rubber at 50 meters and proved that he had been right. They came looking.